Yeah, okay. So this will be a talk about MongoDB security, presented by me, Stephane, and by my former colleague, David. Does it work well? Yeah? Okay, so let's get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here with us on the last afternoon of the conference. So the topic of our talk today will be some tips about MongoDB security. Before we start, a quick introduction about both of us. So David here is a former colleague from me at Percona. And me, Stephane, I was working at Percona, and now I'm a database engineer at Slice Technologies. So the focus of today is really security with Mongo. So we'll have a quick introduction, and then we'll go to different aspects of security. So first, well, security. So security is an interesting topic because it happens quite often that when you talk to the high-level guys, they think that like security is built in their system. So if you try to tell them, oh, well, what you're doing is not secure, they'll just laugh at you. They think, well, it's not possible. But actually, last summer, we had a few interesting reports that came out. And for instance, we can see that nearly 40,000 MongoDB servers were wide open on the internet. And basically, 600 terabytes of data were exposed to everybody. That's huge, right? And I believe that as an IT professional, you don't want that to happen to you, right? So you should care about security. A few more formal ideas about why you should care about security. If some people can steal or change your data without you knowing that, it can harm your business. Let's say, for instance, that you're, some kind of e-commerce website and you propose monthly payments, monthly plans. Say you have someone subscribing to a basic plan like $9.99 a month, and then he can go to your database and then change a few things so that now he's subscribed for a premium plan, but still at $9.99 a month. Well, that's not good for you, of course. Sometimes you also have to comply to regulations like PCI in the payment industry, HIPAA. You have many regulations that are here to make sure that you don't disclose sensitive data to everybody. So you may need to secure your data because of the law. And, well, in some cases, simply your users won't be happy if your data is exposed to everybody. So we've all heard about, I think it was the Sony leakage where millions of email addresses and related data were exposed. Sometimes it's even, it can be a bit more embarrassing, like, so what was the name of the dating, Ashley Madison, right, which was hacked, and you had, I don't know, but many people, the name of many people could be revealed on the internet. Well, that's quite bad. So now, if we look at MongoDB, the question, of course, is MongoDB insecure? And the answer, hopefully, is no, it's not insecure. Now, the point is that well, maybe unfortunately, some of the security features are not enabled by default, which means that if you just install Mongo, do some application stuff on it, against it, and then roll that out, it's not secure. So you will have to take some measures to make your system secure. One good thing, though, and it's a bit like for MySQL, is that the defaults are more and more secure over time. Well, probably because when there's a big security issue with MongoDB related to bad default settings, that can go viral on the internet, and then, well, the MongoDB guys can realize that they should change something. And so because you have security options, but because they may not be enabled by default, you need to have a good understanding about what you have to implement to have decent enough security. some general guidelines about security, so not really MongoDB focused, but in general, when you want to make sure that your system is secured, you want to have several layers of security. So it's like an onion. The data, what you want to protect is at the core, and you have several layers. And if one attacker is able to peel one layer off, well, you have other layers that can prevent the attacker from reaching the data. So that's the idea. And another idea is that if you have a dedicated server, it's easier to secure, simply because you need to have fewer ports open, you have fewer sensitive directories, and so on and so forth. And, well, the good thing is that if you have to do performance tuning, it's also easier if you have dedicated servers. Because if you need to tune, so if on the same server you have a database and you have a web server, well, both will need CPU, for instance. So how do you balance CPU resources between the two applications? That's not always easy. So we'll now talk about network security, and yeah, that will be David.
Okay. So you must enable the firewall. In the early versions of Mongo, it would bind to all interfaces. So as any of you saw my previous talk, any is bad. You know, don't allow access to just global world. I don't care if people need to be able to access this data from their mobile phone whilst they're on a trip in the middle of nowhere. Don't do it. Restrict it to the level of access you need. Path of least privilege is the mantra. If you're running AWS, you can put it inside a VPC. This is default for most deployments now. You have to purposely check EC2 Classic to get into the old network style. Don't do it. Go and research what VPC is. The laser pointer's not working. And go and get it deployed. Use security groups. However, don't rely solely on the security groups because they are, again, a single layer. If Amazon has any issues, and God forbid, they have to disable all security groups, you can open this thing up to the internet. If you've ever heard of a project called Showdown.io, and if you haven't, go visit the website, they mass scan the internet, report back on all ports. There's VNC captures, there's databases open. You type MySQL in there and you get a few 100,000 results. You type Mongo in there, you'll get a few 100,000 results. And more often than not, these things are just wide open. Okay, so yeah, use IP tables. If you haven't got anything else, use IP tables. Use the Ubuntu Firewall, whatever it is you're comfortable with. So, in 2.4 and earlier, as I said, the bind IP is set to 0000, which means bind to all interfaces and listen to the port on this interface. So without proper firewall rules, it's going to be open to everyone on the internet, which is bad. I shouldn't have to tell you that. In 2.6 plus, it defaults to 127.0.0.1. So at this point, you have to make some configuration changes because your web application is not going to be able to access that unless it's on the same box. Don't put your web application on the same box. But it's much more secure in that by default, it's limiting it to the loopback interface. It makes an assumption there's nothing else on that box and has access to the loopback interface, and you're not exposing everything to the internet. Okay. So the default port, as you can see up there, is 27017. And then the config servers run on 27019, but you can override it with a -- port setting. Should you use non-default ports? Well, if you've got the proper firewall rules in place, not so much. You can leave them to the default firewall rules. You can, for the sake of obscurity, you can set IP tables and with the -j drop. Don't do a -j reject. If you do a -j reject, it sends an ICMP back to say to the connecting party, I'm actively rejecting this connection. At which point somebody who's attacking the system, me, will know there's a service on there and that you're probably running Mongo. HTTP interface, yeah. It's read-only, but it can expose useful information for attacker. It runs on port 1000. Yeah, don't have it. Disable it. Just turn it off. There was a person, I can't remember his name now. There's a guy who gave a good DEF CON talk about the Internet of Things. hold your breath and count to 10. Now, does it really need a web server? We seem to be putting a web server on everything. It doesn't need to be there. If you don't need it, turn it off. Okay, so the REST interface is disabled by default in all versions and does not support authentication. Hopefully nobody thinks it's a good idea that we can access the data without authentication. I shouldn't need to say that. So, yeah. SSL/TLS. Communication between the server and the client is not encrypted by default. Same with MySQL. You need to set this stuff up. SSL limits the data exposure on the network. What do we mean by that? If anybody's sniffing the connections or has a presence on your network where they can receive the traffic from any of these nodes, if it's in plain text, I can just get the raw data out from the network caps. It's not hard. If it's in SSL/TLS, it's a lot harder because I ideally need the private key. And then, if you set up some of the algorithms for perfect forwarding sequencing, even with the private keys, I can't decrypt the data. However, before version 3.0, community builds do not include SSL support. So build from the source, including OpenSSL, LibreSSL, Boring SSL, whatever your favorite flavor of SSL is, just have a fucking SSL flavor. So there's a docs Mongo there that you can get the information from. So, okay. So this is going back down to Mongo. I'm going to pass you back.
Yep. Just a clicker. Yep. Thank you. So when you're running MongoDB on your operating system, you have, of course, a user. So it's running under the identity of a user, and of course it shouldn't be root, right? So if you do an install with your package manager, yum apt or anything, that will be done for you, no problem. Now the issue can arise if you do the install manually with a tarball, for instance, because then, well, you grab the tarball and basically you just run the binary. And well, you should remember that you should first create a Linux user and run the binary with that user. Otherwise, that could be very insecure. Don't forget the file permissions on the MongoDB files. So basically, you have several kinds of file. You have the data files, you have the log files, you have the configuration file. So the data files, basically, they should only be readable or writable by the Mongo user. So if the Unix MongoDB user is like Mongo, well, it should be owned and owned by the Mongo user, and only it can read and write. For the log files, pretty much the same thing, because in the log files, you always have some critical, some sensitive information that is exposed. So you don't want anyone to be able to look at the files. And for the configuration file, well, the main point is that you don't want anybody to alter the configuration. Like if you're using authentication, you don't want someone to remove that configuration point, and then at next restart, well, authentication is gone. So everybody can connect with the username and the password. You don't want that. So you want to restrict the permissions probably only to the root user, because the Mongo user will not need to, at least not need to write on that file. Encryption. Encryption can be, of course, an interesting added layer for your security. Some regulations may need you to encrypt your data. With Mongo, it's a bit like, well, so yeah, with MySQL, it's changing. We now have encryption in the latest 5.7, and also
5.7.11.
Yeah. And in MongoDB 10 potentially. In Mongo, you don't have encryption at that point. So the two main options are, well, whether you encrypt data at the application level, so data is encrypted before being sent to the database server, or data is encrypted at the disk level. Both have pros and cons, so choose the better option for you if you need to. Well, last part in this presentation, and I think it's the longest one, is about user security. So how can you create and manage your users inside MongoDB? So by default, when you install a MongoDB server, you don't have authentication and access control. So in Mongo, in the documentation, they basically, which is logical, they made a distinction between authentication and access control. So authentication is really being able to tell you, is that the server can be able to tell who is logging in, and access control is to be able to tell which privileges a given user can have. Well, actually, the two are closely related. So if you enable authentication, you also enable access control. So I will usually talk about access control only, but it means both. So by default, when you install Mongo, access control is disabled. So it means that you can connect without any username, without any password, and everybody has full access to the instance. This is fine for development. This is fine for test. Of course, for production, this is not good at all. So what you should do is to set the security.authorization equals enabled. That is for a standalone instance, because when you're using replica sets or sharded cluster, it's just a bit different. We'll use a key file that's a few slides later. So basically, you have a configuration point to enable authorization, and that also enables access control. And one thing to know in Mongo is that access control is based on roles. So you have a list of predefined roles, and each role includes a set of privileges. So that's quite different from MySQL, where access control is based on privileges only. One thing you may read in the documentation is the localhost exception. So what you can do with Mongo is you want to secure your setup, so you will enable access control. But at that point, you haven't created any user. So unfortunately, now you can no longer connect to Mongo. It seems a bit stupid, but this is what happens. But you have the localhost exception. And if you connect to a MongoDB instance from the localhost, even if you don't have any users in this instance, and even if access control is enabled, you can still log in, and you have full access. The goal of that is to be able to create an admin user. Okay, so you enable access control by setting the configuration point. Then you restart Mongo. At this point, no one can connect, except with the localhost exception. So you connect from the localhost, then you create an admin user, disconnect, and with this you connect back with this admin user, and then you can now create all the other users. One thing to know is that up to 5.2.6, the localhost exception was always in effect, which means that when you enable access control, when you create your users, if by any chance someone connects from the localhost, it always had full privileges, which is a bit silly, right? So in 2.6, it was fixed. In 2.6, the localhost exception is only valid until you create the first user. Once you've created the first user, the localhost exception no longer works, which is much better, of course. You have another option if you don't want to be blocked by I've enabled access control, but I don't have any user. You can create the users first without enabling access control, and then restart MongoDB with access control. Because creating the users doesn't require you to have access control beforehand. You can do in the way you want. Maybe it's a bit more easier to do that way. So now to create an admin user, it will be a user with the user admin any database role. And the important thing to notice is that this user will live in the admin database. So you create the user like that. So db.createUser, you specify the username, the password, and you specify the roles. Okay. So yeah, I forgot to ask at the beginning how many of you are already using Mongo. I don't know if that's everybody or just a few of us. So who's already using Mongo? 1, 2, 3. Okay. So as you can see, this is quite different from MySQL. So once you have your admin user, let's say for all the databases, what you can do is to create an admin user for a specific database. So this is totally optional, but well, depending on your on the application, if you have several databases, depending on the staff you have, maybe you want that this guy can only have access or can only be the admin for database X, and this guy is only the admin for database Y. It might be useful. It depends. So basically the syntax is exactly the same, so you will still use the db.createUser function. Two differences. The first one is that the role is user admin and not user admin any database, right? And also you will you will specify that this role is for the MyDB database, for instance, and not the admin database, which will mean an admin for the whole instance. So a few words about roles. When you create a user, as we can see here, we can specify a list of roles. So I have the roles keyword. So it means that I'm not limited to only one role. So when if the role is user admin or user admin database, user admin any database, doesn't really make sense to have more roles. But for like unprivileged users, you can then say, okay, this user has the read role on this database, the write role on this database, and so on and so forth. So, as I think I mentioned before, each role includes a set of privileges. So the best thing is, of course, to go to the online documentation to make sure that what you think is included in a role is actually included, because, well, there are some changes over time. So it's not the same thing in 2.6, in 3.0, in 3.2. So yeah, could be interesting to check from time to time. So there is a pretty wide list of built-in roles that can allow you to define lots of permissions, lots of users. But if you think that you need a role that doesn't fit into the existing categories, you can always create a custom role. And yeah, you have the manual here about the built-in roles, and you'll find there also the documentation on the user-defined roles. One other thing to know is that if a user has several roles, the final privileges that he will have is the union of all the privileges, right? So if you say that one user has the read privilege, and I don't know, like it doesn't exist, but let's say so it's the union of the privilege. So you don't that's the union. Okay. So once you've created your admin user or users, you will then create your application users. So basically here, you will need the read role and or the read-write role. Okay? So for instance here, I have a user which can read and write on the MyDB database and only read on the OverDB database. So this is how you can define a user which has different roles or different privileges in different databases. Okay. Key files. So I mentioned before that if you have a standalone instance, to enable access control, you will set the security.authorization setting to enabled. If you use a replica set or if you use a sharded cluster, which in production you should probably do, authentication should be done with a key file. So authentication is done for all internal communication between all the MongoDB instances, and also for like interactions between the client and the cluster or the replica set. And when you set the key file setting, it also turns on access control. So once you specify a key file, don't forget to create the application users, the admin users, etc. So what is the key file? Well, that's simply a file which stores a string. And basically, so that's a shared secret string between all the instances. You have a few requirements on that file. It must be less than 1 kilobyte. The permissions should be 600. And the key file should be the same on all servers. So not too difficult. So when you have a replica set or a sharded cluster, as I mentioned, all the communication will use the key file. Okay. So all communication means client to the cluster, but it also means MongoS to MongoD, MongoS to config server, anything. And yeah, don't forget to create the users. So if you have a sharded cluster, how can you enable access control? First thing, you create a key file. I should have added step 2, which is distribute the key file on all the instances. Okay, because you need the same key file everywhere. Then you set security.keyfile equals, well, path to the key file in the setting of all MongoDB instances. So again, all instances, the config servers as well as the standard data nodes, and also for MongoS. And then you need to restart all the instances. So that's one thing I think, no, I didn't specify that. So that's one thing to know, because you need to restart, well, actually, because once an instance has the key file setting turned on, it can only talk to other instances that have the key file setting turned on. So basically, when you want to enable access control for a sharded cluster, you have to bring the whole cluster down for some time. Okay? So you restart all the instances, and then you will need to create the users. And when you create the users, it's very important to connect to MongoS. Okay? So connect to MongoS via the local exception, as we saw before. And there you should add all the users that you need. So the admin, the user admin, any database, the application users, etc., etc. So same as for standalone instances, if you don't want to use the localhost exception, you can create the users first and then restart the instances with the key file setting. That will enable access control. So that also works. Yeah, okay. So yeah, adding access control requires some downtime. Another thing to keep in mind is that even when you have created some users, so an admin user, an application user, on MongoOS for the sharded cluster, you can still connect with the localhost exception to any of the shards. So this can seem a bit weird, but actually what happens is that when you connect to MongoOS to create a user, this user, the data related to this user is actually stored in the config server, not on the shards. So if you connect directly to one shard, actually you have no user there. So the localhost exception works, okay? And you probably don't want to have that because, well, in general, when you have a sharded cluster, you want all the connections to go through MongoOS, and you want no one to connect directly to a shard. So it's quite recommended to either create a user directly on the shard, because if you remembered what I said earlier, as soon as you create a user, the localhost exception stops working, or you also have a setting to disable the localhost exception. So you can do that. What I prefer is to disable the localhost exception because it seems a bit weird to go to a shard, create a user simply to disable the localhost exception. So that doesn't seem the right way to do stuff for me. But well, it's allowed. So basically, do either of the two options, and then your sharded cluster should be secured correctly. So all the users will have to connect through MongoOS, as expected, and if anyone tries to connect directly to a shard, with the localhost exception, it won't work, which is what you want. And I think this is, pretty much what we wanted to cover. So we still have some time for questions if you have. Yep.
So when you're creating users, I've seen it done both ways. You create them in the admin database. When creating users, you can create them in the admin database or in the specific database that they're using. And then if you create them in the admin database, when they log in, they have to authenticate against admin with the DB authentication parameter. So is there a preferred way to do it? I've seen it done both ways. What we're doing is we're putting them in both in case the application doesn't support the DB authentication parameter. Is there any particular security risk with doing it both ways?
So in general, the recommendation is that what should be in the admin database is the system level stuff, or let's say the cluster level stuff, because let's assume that you have a sharded cluster. So it's everything that is global, and at the database level, this is more for like the application users. Okay, so basically, in general, you want to create your admin user in the admin database because it's admin for everything, and then when you have application users, it can depend, of course, but usually they will mostly use one database. So you will create them in this database. And
so you're assuming that the database is already there. Sometime with Mongo, you just say use database and do an insert, and it creates database on the fly. So some applications might be creating databases on the fly as part of their need. So you'd have to put them in the admin database. So they could go on and do things in all the other databases. So I guess
you're
based
totally
on
right.
whatever need you have, I guess my question is there a security risk putting users in the admin database and authenticating there? Because unless you have the password,
I don't think so. So maybe I'm wrong. I don't think I've seen that. So I don't have anything that comes to my mind telling me, and I'm not able to tell you, oh well, that's wrong because of that. So well, I assume that in your situation that's the way to go, because otherwise that can be quite complex. Yeah. Any other questions? No. Well then, thank you.